Alistair Ramsay and I mull over the April Tynwald sitting and consider what were the highlights. The independent inquiry on COVID, banks trying to charge for charity accounts, and is Chris Thomas the new thorn in government's side? That's all on the Agenda podcast with me, Phil Gaughan, Manx Radio's very own political inquisitor. Will our ministers be prepared to make bold decisions, or will the cautious advice of civil servants smother their enthusiasm? Alistair Ramsay, a few weeks ago we had you on the Perspective programme and we were discussing the forthcoming Tynwald agenda. I said that we'd have you back because we should find out how did Tynwald actually go. So what were the highlights as far as you could see in relation to the order paper? Were your predictions proved correct?
Well, my main prediction was that the Tim Glover's motion on bank charges for charities would be amended and considerably softened by the government side, and that proved to be the case. The Treasury amendment was carried. Tim wanted Tynwald to instruct the government to bring forward new laws to stop banks from imposing charges on charities. It ended up with a far softer form of words from the Treasury, which merely recognises the ongoing work that government's doing to ensure fair banking for charities and philanthropic organisations. So the rather dramatic and bold wording was diluted as we thought it would be.
And interestingly, the wording wasn't challenged by any of the government side speakers. And I suppose that's a clever ruse on their part, because they don't want to say, well, I don't think you can do this, because then they could end up in a row with the Clerk of Tynwald's office. Yes. But it was unique in my experience that Tynwald instructs the government to do something.
Yes, I don't suppose any minister wants to turn to the backbenchers and say, you can't instruct us to do anything, because that's just inviting somebody to prove a point, isn't it?
Indeed. And, constitutional battles are not something that should be courted unless absolutely necessary.
No. One of the things that I did notice or look at in some detail was the Treasury Minister's statement on the financial situation. And some of that was a lot of that was reviewing what we already know, that there's a perfect storm of pressures on the economy and cost of living, inflation, which is expected to reach as high as 10% later this year.
That's a really quite disturbing figure, isn't it?
It is.
10%.
Yeah, the politicians are fond of saying we face unprecedented challenges, but I think it's definitely true in this situation, and I think all of us who are a bit more senior can't remember anything quite this drastic. I don't think there's convergence of pressures.
I think it's going back to the 1970s, really, isn't it? When inflation was really skyrocketing.
That recent.
Yeah. And what... ultimately, what's the big deal about inflation being as high as that? I mean, how is that going to affect most people?
Well, it's just the cost of living, especially in this case, energy costs. A lot of households are on very, very thin margins, or in some cases no margin at all. I mean, a lot of people live hand to mouth. Anyone who's got a family knows that. And any government attempts to help are overtaken by this kind of accelerating inflationary pressure.
And I suppose government's attempt to help almost pour fuel on the runaway inflation too, because quite clearly it adds additional pressures onto the economy by increasing benefits and increasing this, that, and the other. I mean, imagine if at the month in which benefits are set, they pick a particular month of the year,
September,
don't they?
I think.
Yeah, and if inflation is at 10% there, 10% increase on benefits would be a massive impact on particularly the National Insurance Fund, which we heard on last week's show from Chris Thomas is being chipped away at from time to time by the government.
Indeed, and this is one of the points that the Treasury Minister was making, as you'd expect a Treasury Minister to do, was that the government finances are also under pressure. They're a major energy user in their own right. The value of their reserves is down. They've got a lot of upward pressure on their wage bill. And the measures that they've announced so far, I think, in terms of their special extra benefits, are nearly £6 million worth. They've also lost about £2 million on fuel duty reductions. So they're already £8 million down just in that area. So he was. What I was also interested in was that he made the point that the pressures were so great that any increase in income tax would not make much difference. And I thought it was interesting that he kind of went out of his way to rule that out.
It's always been the case. I think Isle of Man government have been loath to look at headline rates of income tax as a potential filler for economic woes. I can't remember now what the figure is for each percent, but it's each percent increase in income tax. It's not a huge amount in terms of millions that come back.
It doesn't make a massive difference unless you did something quite drastic.
And then the argument against is if you do something quite dramatic or drastic, as you say, then chances are you may stall the economy because people will have less income available to them, and at a time when pockets are being squeezed anyway with runaway inflation, the last thing you need to do is whack up taxes as well.
I mean, you're adding to the pain on households and businesses. But what I thought was interesting was towards the end of his statement, the Treasury Minister said that all departments would have cost improvement programmes to try and mitigate the impact on their own budgets, but also, and this will take us back a few years, would look at increasing fees and charges where these would not impact on low income groups. Now, this is precisely the problems that previous governments have got into with stealth charges. And I think if the squeezed middle, so-called, ordinary kind of middle-ranking people, if they think the government is sneaking in these kind of increases in fees and charges, the stealth tax issue, whilst it's perceived to be growing and growing. I mean, we've had more headlines about, 300 more public, government workers in the last year. I think there'll be a fairly angry reaction, and I think the government might be advised that putting up those fees and charges is more trouble than it's worth.
Because in a way, the minister's statement there is a bit of an oxymoron in as much as, by their very definition, these stealth taxes, the increased charges, affect most people, whether they have low incomes or whether they have high incomes, and they affect them in exactly the same way, which is a wholly non-progressive, taxing effectively everybody the same amount, whether they are multi-billionaires or really struggling to put food on the table.
I was puzzled by that, because having ruled out income tax increases, basically because that would just add to people's pain, you then look at increasing fees and charges, which are perceived as other forms of tax, albeit that you're trying to avoid harming low-income groups. I think they're going to get a lot of trouble if they go down that road.
Yes, it's trying to burn the candle both ends a little, isn't it? Again, the minister has been on this programme saying that he's concerned about the future for business on the island, particularly with all the increased costs, increased inflation. No doubt there'll be increases in pressures for wage settlements. So he's already acknowledged that. So it can't be then increasing charges for businesses, you would think. So you wonder who the increased charges are going to affect.
I don't think they could get away with passing on costs to the public unless they're visibly taking some pain internally at the same time.
Yes, and I suppose the problem government has there is the pain has been being inflicted upon departments. It may not be obvious to the public, but it's certainly obvious to anyone working in departments. Certainly if anyone's been working in a department of government over probably the last 15 years now, they will have seen the times of plenty when perhaps it was reasonable to throw the charge at government that money was being squandered. The budgets have been cut. The work of maybe 3 or 4 people is now being done by one, and it's difficult to see where easy cuts can be made, particularly at a time when they're talking. Well, if they're talking about funding the underfund in the health budget, they're talking about. The teachers are saying that their salaries have diminished as a general proportion compared with other trades in the Manx economy. So the pressures are there, but the big spenders are education and health and social care. And if you've already committed to putting health and social care budgets up, and you're in dispute with the teachers in relation to a significant increase in pay. Who's going to get the hit? The next biggest spending department, of course, is the Department of Infrastructure, which clearly, according to most people, and I think the minister's on board with this, is struggling as it is to maintain the infrastructure we've got.
And yet we get headlines about 300 more government workers. There's perception that the size of government is growing and growing, especially around the Cabinet Office, fairly or unfairly. That's perceived to be a kind of top-heavy bureaucracy there.
Yes, it is suggested that this is the backdoor way of introducing the single entity government that many politicians have talked about for some time. Actually, if you bring everything into the Cabinet Office, eventually you make a single entity for government. But perhaps that's unfair.
Yes, I think that would be a spectacularly clumsy way of doing it.
Which then doesn't rule it out, does it?
No, indeed not.
One of the things that we were pretty confident would go through reasonably without much debate or concern was the independent inquiry into the government's handling of COVID over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. Our prediction, I think, on that one was correct. The debate was relatively short. There wasn't much by way of challenge. Mr. Speaker, in his remarks, mentioned that there was a little bit of a concern about the appointment of the chair, and I think this was something that we'd picked up on as well, as to how can you have an independent chair that's picked by a Council of Ministers, and it does appear as though a political panel, potentially involving ministers and the Public Accounts Committee, may well be the way in which this is to be chosen, this independent chair. The Chief Minister was actually said in the debate, and of course, just because we pick the person doesn't mean that they are beholden unto us in any way. They will then, once they've been picked, be able to act wholly independently. And on the one hand, I suppose he's right, but on the other hand, perception is quite important. And if you pick a particular person because you believe that particular person is likely to find in your favour, then you are influencing the independent inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The perception is so important here. And you've got to remember that some current members of the Council of Ministers will be under scrutiny by this review. So it's important that they aren't seen to have sole jurisdiction over the appointment, and that this whole exercise so far has been an interesting joint enterprise between the parliamentary side and the Council of Ministers side. So you would expect that job of finding the right person would be also a joint panel rather than just the ministers. If they insisted on keeping it to themselves, I think that would be quite short-sighted and could backfire on them.
And the reason, of course, this matters is, government have made decisions. I think many people on the Isle of Man believe government, on the whole, handled the whole COVID situation very well. However, people died. People have lost loved ones and been unable to visit them in care homes or in hospital settings. Businesses have lost money. Some businesses, no doubt, will have gone out of business as a result of the restrictions put in place. So it is really important that it is an independent inquiry.
Absolutely. And there's a tendency for people to see these things as kind of witch hunts or, what's the point of going over the old ground? But for a community to go through the trauma that we've been through, and like communities around the world, without then learning the lessons of that experience and actually kind of capturing those so that in the future, when something similar happens, you're at least a little bit better prepared, would be unthinkable, I think. And it is about learning the lessons. If you have to criticise some decisions along the way, yes, you can understand that people were in an unprecedented situation. They were under a lot of pressure. But I think you do need an honest appraisal of what worked, what didn't work.
And of course, the other reason for all of this is something like this could happen again. And if there are obvious lessons to be learned, obvious areas that could have been improved upon, better to learn those lessons in advance of something similar having to happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the other items on the order paper was one from Joni Farragher in relation to government effectively establishing an adequate policy in relation to refugees. How did that motion go?
Well, it succeeded largely. It was amended by the Cabinet Office Minister, Kate Lord-Brennan, who just built on it really to say that this exercise should take account of the experience they've had in dealing with Ukrainian refugees, but also put the deadline for the report back to July 2023. Joni's deadline was a quite ambitious July this year. And it is a big subject. It's very complex. When you think that only a couple of years ago we were told that the Isle of Man couldn't have its own scheme for refugees, there's a lot of international and legal complication around this. So it'll be very interesting to see what they come up with.
Yes, and I understand the minister responsible, Kate Lord-Brennan, did seem to imply that the situation with the Ukrainian refugees was resolved in relatively swift time compared to perhaps other countries, we have Ukrainian refugees on the island.
I have to say, I was quite impressed to see the minister down there in London talking to various ambassadors and people and kind of getting stuck in and not being deterred by the very considerable bureaucratic obstacles that must be in the way of doing something like this. So I think that was pretty impressive.
Absolutely, and something. If ministers happen to be listening in, I would hope that they would do more of, because actually the one of the great benefits of the Isle of Man is our scale and our ability to move swiftly. Yeah. This is what we keep being told by government, and we are a Crown dependency, yes, but we are not part of the United Kingdom, and we have the ability to move on international matters if we so choose.
And sometimes politicians have to take the bull by the horns and not be put off by the kind of cautious civil service and legal advice, which is necessary, but politics is kind of a step beyond that.
Absolutely. I think sometimes politicians do get drawn into the general malaise, which is civil service cautious advice. Obviously, this is what civil servants are supposed to do. They are supposed to provide you with, this is what would happen if all this goes wrong. But ultimately, we elect politicians to provide leadership, political leadership for the island, and making bold decisions is what ministers are expected to do.
It does require a bit of confidence to do that, and given that some of these ministers aren't that experienced as ministers, they seem to have had that confidence.
One of the things, and I spoke to Tim Glover about this on last week's Perspective programme, the thing that particularly I noticed about the Order paper was how light it was on government business. We are now approaching the end of the first year of this administration. So we're 20% through. There's been hardly any bills passed, although I noticed the Health Minister trying to rush one through tomorrow. But very little by way of, this is us now enacting the policy decisions that we've announced in our island plan. Maybe it's a bit early for that, but you would have thought that hitting the ground running would have been part of the strong leadership which is being offered by the current Chief Minister.
I think there are limits, realistically, to how soon you can hit the ground running. I mean, it sounds good, but, you've got to work out where you're going first. And having said that, I think the new regime's approach is to create a kind of new architecture of government, of various new committees and structures and processes. So they may still be kind of moving the furniture around. The danger is that they spend most of their term doing that. Also, in fairness, they've had almost a crisis to deal with. I mean, it is a crisis with the cost of living. You've still got the coming out of COVID, tremendous pressures on the economy and on households. So I think the Council of Ministers will have been pretty busy dealing with those challenges.
And I suppose the final thing about this Tynwald just gone, this month's Tynwald, is the interesting forays into political aggression, perhaps by former Minister Chris Thomas. Obviously not made a minister this time round, appointed to be chair of a board which then turns out perhaps to be a collection of individuals without very much power or budget. Do you think Chris Thomas is starting to become a thorn in the side of the government?
That is a very interesting question. I mean, maybe that's why this arrangement was contrived in the first place. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting that he's in charge, or he's the head of a very important policy area, and it's probably one of the biggest issues to come out of the last election, and that they've outsourced that to what looks like an old-fashioned board, the status of which I'm still not entirely clear about. Does Chris come up with some quite radical proposals which are then lost in the Council of Ministers? I mean, it's curious, but it also gives him that freedom to be kind of in government and also outside it.
Yes, it's certainly one I will be watching over the course of the next 2 or 3 Tynwalds, particularly the question papers, I think.
Yeah.
That was Alistair Ramsay helping us understand the big political decisions Tynwald was taking on your behalf. Please get in touch with Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on the programme. But for now, I'm Phil Gorn. Guramayo. Thanks for listening.